Welcome, everyone. We are going to start in just a minute. In the meantime, if you'd like to say hi in the chat and where you're coming from, we'd love to introduce you, introduce, meet you. And great. I think we are going to kick off now. So, hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Building World-Class Teams event. If you've been with us before, we've actually done, this is our seventh one now. So, we're making a habit out of this and glad you could join us. This one is to talk about the investment case. So, what does culture have to do with getting investment? I'm Melissa Sabella. I'm the founder and CEO the Honeycomb Works. And I'm thrilled to be here today. And I will tell you a little bit about more about us and the Honeycomb Works, but first a little bit of housekeeping. So just to let you know, you probably were informed of this when you came in that this webinar is being recorded. Captions are available throughout. So to enable them, click more options and click enable captions. Chat is open, so feel free to talk to us or amongst yourselves. We are moderating just to make sure that it is a safe space. So any appropriate messages will be removed. And if you're a repeat offender, we will kick you out. But we do want you to feel safe to ask questions because that's what we're here for. If you don't want to put it in the public chat, you can send a message direct to hosts and panelists and also use the Q&A function to do anonymous questions. And do put your questions into the Q&A because we've got the absolutely brilliant Elodie Broad here, who you will meet in a little bit, who is here to answer your burning questions about this. And how often do you get to ask an anonymous question to somebody who is at Balderton Capital? So really good opportunity there. Please do ask questions. Again, just a little bit about us. So we are the Honeycomb Works, and our mission is for everyone at work to feel like they belong and are free to invent. So we help organizations build inclusive and innovative cultures through behavior change and data because cultures are created habit by habit, person by person. So it's the things that people do on a day-to-day basis or don't do that make some place safe for everyone to speak up, share ideas, challenge each other, do brilliant things, or not. And you could have award-winning processes, the best of intentions, but still create a toxic culture that ultimately ends up destroying your dreams. So that's what we are here to stop people from doing, or to help people create those cultures where that doesn't happen. And to do that, we've created a digital honeycomb that helps people develop those positive behaviors and organizations to understand their areas of risk. We've actually created a specific version of the Honeycomb platform for startups and scale-ups in collaboration with the Royal Academy of Engineering. And the reason I'm talking about this now is just to give you a little bit of a background on why you should listen to us. Because in the creation of this, we spent about 2 years doing deep research into what's happening in startups and scale-ups, both by talking to founders, employees, but also doing desk research and reading papers and really gathering the evidence of what goes wrong and what goes right. And so everything that we talk about has evidence behind it. Now, when we talk about culture, it can be kind of a mushy thing. So I want to make sure that we sort of define it a bit. What are we actually talking about when we say a positive culture, an inclusive culture? What we're trying to achieve here is a place where a diverse group of people with different perspectives all feel safe to share ideas, challenge each other, take risks, and speak up. And this is all based on, again, research evidence of what leads to positive cultures. But when we start talking about things like an inclusive culture, people kind of feel like, is this a place where everybody's scared to say anything? People are walking on eggshells. They're just all trying to be nice to each other. And actually, it's really not that. In fact, when we walk into an organization and we see that, we know that that is not a safe culture, that people are worried and uncertain. So what we're trying to do is get to a place where people feel safe to challenge each other and take risks and contradict each other, absolutely. But they can do that because there's an underlying respect there. And it's understood that these challenges are not personal, they're not attacks, and they don't make people feel like they don't belong there. They don't question their right to be there when they are faced with something that is questioning one of their ideas. Rather, they feel like, yes, we're building something together, and this is making my idea better. And what research tells us is that creating these diverse, inclusive cultures where everyone feels like they belong also lead to innovation. So there's tons of research that say that these cultures are how you have scientific breakthroughs. One of the other founders that we work with is always talking about science is about failure, right? 90% of the time you're failing in your experiments in order to learn and develop. And if you don't have a place where people can fail safely, then you're not going to have that breakthrough. You're not going to innovate. So why are we here when we're talking? Why is it so important to talk to investors about this or get the investor perspective on this? And that's because so often where we see it going wrong is right at that point where a team gets investment because you're scaling. And at a lot of startups, they're doing okay in their culture when they're small. Now, when I say they're doing okay, I don't mean there's zero harm, that everything's great. There actually might be some harm being caused. There might be some people who are not doing well. You might not be innovating as much, but you might not see it. And it might not make things blow up because it's manageable, because you're a small group of people. You could probably work some things out. But once you get that investment and you start scaling your team, that's when those little cracks turn into chasms. And you can end up falling in. So there's this great post I saw from the founder of Doist, who's had tremendous success, and he said he was interviewing all these head of people candidates, and it was the same story over and over again about why they were leaving. Company finds product market fit, company gets investment and starts hiring. The bad culture, he says mass hiring results in bad culture. I'm going to say partially, but probably also partially there were some things there that then just got exacerbated, inefficiency, and then layoffs. This is what we really want to avoid, right? Because it's tragic. And especially if we're talking about engineering startups that are trying to change the world and make everything better for all of us. We want you to succeed. You want to succeed. So it's absolutely heartbreaking to get to a point where you're delivering something that people say they want, they need, and your company blows up not because of the innovation, but because of culture. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And in a series of research from CB Insights about why startups fail, tons of reasons. Now, this is a list that keeps me as a founder up at night, but the thing that's in common about all those things is that it's people who are facing these challenges. So if you don't have a group of people who can tackle these things together in a productive way, you're not gonna succeed, right? These things are going to be the things that ends up hurting you. So that's what we're trying to address today, and why we want to focus on the investment side of things. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a fireside chat with Elodie, who you'll meet in a moment. Then I'm going to tell you about four very specific things you can do to put a structure in place to help you avoid these challenges. We're going to go to your questions, and then we're going to talk a little bit about taking action. So that's our strategy for the day. We would love to stay in touch with you, so please do subscribe. You'll get newsletters. Really happy to say we're not great at sending tons of stuff, so don't worry, you won't be inundated. We only send things when we really have something to say, but it will keep you updated on future webinars. We've got a few really great in-person events planned with like canapes and booze and also really smart things to talk about. So do sign up so you can get your invitations to those. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over I'm going to let Elodie introduce herself. But just to say, we've been talking for a bit now since I started looking at asking this question about like investors must really care about this stuff, right? And Elodie's got such a great perspective on the things that they're doing at Balderton to support people, and yes, why it's so important. But Elodie, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. So, hi everyone. My name is Elodie Broad, and as per the words on the slide, I am the head of impact and sustainable future goals at Balderton Capital. For those who don't know us, Balderton Capital is one of the largest European VC funds based of London. We've been around backing European founders for coming up to 25 years now in an industry agnostic way. So we've got representation from, a broad range of industries in the portfolio. A few portfolio companies of ours that you might know include Revolut, so in the fintech space, Wave, so deep tech, autonomous vehicle technology, Helix, using precision medicine to accelerate the discovery of drugs against very complex diseases. Photoroom, Zoe, Tibber, across AI, climate tech, and consumer tech as well. So a real sort of breadth of companies there that we've supported anywhere from their sort of late seed stage all the way to Series B, C with our growth fund. And so you might ask us yourselves, what is a head of impact and sustainable future goals in a generalist fund such as Balderton? So in 2020, Balderton Capital launched its Sustainable Future Goal strategy. Think of it as an impact or sustainability strategy, feeling that they wanted to make a really strong public statement on the responsibility, but also the opportunity of VC as an asset class to shape the next generation of businesses in a way that set the growth towards a sort of responsible and sustainable businesses. And so we currently have 6 goals falling under those sustainable future goals, one of which is about equity and inclusion. And so I think the topic that we're discussing today around building an inclusive culture, building diversity of thought, and creating environment psychological safety falls under that. And I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Elodie. So the first question is that, and you sort of talked about this a little bit, but you are an investor. Well, you and Balderton are investors who actually care about culture and diversity and inclusion. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, great question. I think, so as mentioned, there is this sense of responsibility and opportunity that comes with being, stewards to a portfolio of potentially the next generation of really, really big businesses. But at the end of the day, we are a venture capital fund, and our number one, mandate and purpose is to make money. And so we strongly believe in the business case of building a business on really solid foundations when it comes to people and culture, because as to some of the previous slides you showed, we've just seen so many failures that can be sort of tied back to people issues. And vice versa, we believe that that early stage of growth are really sort of foundational years, sometimes it can be months,
Mm.
it goes really, really fast. Is in terms of like setting the right tone, be very clear with the why and building that culture. As you say, culture is about habit by habit, person by person. And so doing it from the get-go is much easier. We're also lucky that there's plenty of literature. Well, I think plenty, or definitely a growing, evidence base of research on precisely this sort of return on investment. So
Mm.
I've just actually got a few data points here from Diversity VC, who are a network-based organization that brings the VC industry to talk about this topic and challenging us as funds and firms to think about diversity in the broader sense. So how this business case applies to us as we operate, but obviously our performance is strongly tied to the portfolios as well. So just a really great some really great resources there. So recent studies show that inclusive companies with multiple perspectives throughout their workforce demonstrated 2.3 times higher cash flow per employee over a 3-year period, 1.7 times more likely to be innovation leaders in their market, 3.8 times more likely to be able to coach people from improved performance, 12% longer employee retention, and lots of other benefits around your employee satisfaction, employee behavior, etc. So I think both, ourselves anecdotally in our lived experience with the companies that we've been lucky enough to support and back and follow over the years, but also some of the sort of external, increasingly quantitative data, longitudinal studies that are really proving the point of why it makes financial sense to spend sufficient amount of time thinking about building a diverse and inclusive workforce.
Yeah, there are a couple of great that we have those stats, right? Because I mean, as a founder, right, you're under so much pressure to prioritize, and you can never do all the things that you need to do. So I think for a lot of founders that we talk to, it can feel like a nice to have. But there are a couple of things you said in there that I think would really got my attention. One is sometimes it could be sort of as a month in which you're making all of these changes, and that you can face issues. And then also around retention, the cost of retention, especially when you're moving quickly and scaling, is very serious, and something that, yeah, can throw a spanner in the works, I think, in the early stages.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So, why do you think this is? So that's all of the external. We know that it's true. What have you seen sort of in the day to day as organizations sort of interact um, about why these positive cultures lead to better outcomes?
I think you sort of touched on it already, but if I were to really crystallize it, I think it comes down, two words come to mind, like innovation and risk mitigation. And you rightly say, like, actually risk taking and failure is an integral part of really successful, effective sort of innovation. But I think innovation really comes down to, we want those companies, if they're going to be disrupting a whole industry, like, they need to think
Mm.
outside of the box. And so I think it's ensuring that diversity of thought and diversity of perspectives exists in the organization. So that's about, the sourcing. And then, but ensuring that then the right environment is created for people to feel like they can actually speak up. And I think, because if people start being um, and actually, let's flip it as a positive. In an environment when people are invited to speak up, and there's no such thing as a bad question, there's no such thing as a bad idea, then you're really encouraging, outside the box thinking and potential those breakthroughs that I think that you mentioned. On the flip side, if you apply that same reasoning to actually risk mitigation, I think the argument still holds. So around something not seeming quite right, and maybe feeling empowered and confident enough to speak up, even if, hierarchically, it's not necessarily your place to say anything. And
Mhm.
I always like to come back to those examples from sort of social science in the 80s. I think spent a lot of time trying to understand a bit more the importance of culture in more so public services, and I think NASA as well. So they did some research in the 80s with NASA flight crews and then hospital staff, and with, on the surface, quite surprising findings. For example, that teams with better teamwork made more mistakes, or that a tired team outperformed a well-rested team when considering flight safety. But turns out that it all came down to the culture of trust and psychological safety to actually admit and discuss mistakes. So those
Wow.
contexts where there was this more inclusive culture only led to more reported mistakes, because in other contexts they were probably still happening, certainly still happening, but just
Yeah.
weren't being reported. And so I really think, if we were to sort of sum it up, it comes out to, building an inclusive culture, a setting of sort of psychological safety where diverse perspectives are encouraged and values, can both maximize the biggest and best ideas being developed, but also minimize the sort of potential value destructing mistakes, as we've seen kind of plenty of over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting that the two pieces that you're talking about, both risk mitigation and taking risks. And to be able to do both of those things, you need to have those cultures. Like they're not, they might seem like opposites of each other, but they're really not, because that taking risks bit, if you don't have that diverse perspectives, you're going to mess up. So if you're trying to be, as you said, disruptive and change an industry and do something that hasn't been done before, then if you don't have a variety of perspectives, you're going to end up causing harm. So you're going to end up, the new medical devices that we've seen that don't work on darker skin, or a delivery robot that was blocking wheelchair access to streets. Like if you don't have people um, that will see those things, then these disruptive technologies, well, you don't want to be making headlines, do you? But you're also not going to be coming up with new ideas about how we might support those folks. And a lot of great innovations actually come from edge cases of we're trying to help a small group of people who experience the world differently, and creating something for them that actually then ends up making everybody else's life better. So yeah, so that like if you're going to take those risks, you need to make sure that you have those different perspectives in order to make sure that you're not causing harm as you take those risks and make those leaps.
Definitely. And most business models will somewhat be based on like how broad a customer kind of group can I reach, or how many different customer segments can I kind of cater to? Because that's often how growth kind of comes along. And it's true that I'm seeing a lot of companies thinking about what's called can be called like the accessibility kind of piece. So how do you ensure that you have diverse representation and perspective internally to be able to build as kind of diverse and far-reaching and accessible products in return. So I think this is a really interesting kind of symbiotic relationship there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that a lot of startups will struggle with is there'll be small teams. So they'll say, well, I can't possibly hire everyone with every different experience of the world. But I think that's where also you can be creative. So when we started, we were three able-bodied white people, because we were a management buyout, and that was the team. And so one of the things we did immediately was put our technology in place to support an organization that helped refugees learn to code. And by doing that, we managed to have a really wide, diverse group of people actively using our technology and plugged into a community of developers and creators who could give us some really valuable feedback. So we gave them something of value in return for the value that they gave back to us. But like those are the kinds of things that you really need to be thinking about when you're in that mode where like, okay, we can't hire a massive team that's going to have full coverage, but let's look at where our gaps are and then make sure that we find a way to fill those gaps.
Love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about employer brand, because you mentioned recruitment and retention and how people like it. Is it tough to attract folks? Does it not matter in this market anymore because it's an employer's market, or is this a significant factor in culture and recruitment and bringing folks in?
Yeah, so I think there is definitely, and there will always be sort of talent war because it's a relative exercise. Like, there's the workforce and sort of the pyramid of sort of talent, and I guess any startup aspiration you should aim for just to attract the sort of the top of that pyramid in terms of skills and experience and resilience and all those, characteristics that you might be looking into in your prospective talent. I guess so the talent war is definitely still there. And then there's also a lot of chat about, the new generation of talent who potentially are more, purpose-led, or want, have this sort of new relationship with their career, and where actually softer characteristics such as culture, such as, purpose, etc., are actually more important, alongside the more traditional kind of harder kind of parts of an offer, sort of package and location and working arrangements, etc. And so I think when it comes to culture, what's quite interesting is that, I mean, candidates can rightly and have legitimately asked to meet as many people as they want before
Mhm.
accepting an offer. I think it's easy to do a bit of window dressing as part of a hiring process and talk about, oh, how great the culture is, etc. But I think if you think about what's your long-term goal here, it's entering like a marriage, like a relationship, like it's as much, you being the right employer for this person as much as, this person being meeting the needs of your company at this point in time. So I always, would be very cautious about overstating and just setting unrealistic
Mm.
expectations and actually just almost I mean, lying is a bit stronger word, but like inflating how great culture you are, because culture is something that's felt and experienced from day one, and so they'll very
Yeah.
quickly feel it if what they've been kind of pitched or sold, it doesn't really match what they get to experience internally. And the biggest risk is that they actually decide that that's not the right fit for them, and 6 months down the line you'll find yourself again like going through the cost of having to hire
Yeah.
someone else, and the opportunity cost of the time, effort, and time that you'd have lost in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the research that we looked at, it said it was 35,000 pounds for every employee that you don't retain, and that's entry level. So if you're talking about like senior engineers, then that's going to be, much more challenging as well. Not to mention the opportunity cost, where time obviously is absolutely critical, and hiring well takes time. So you go through that process. You've got notice periods, and then if somebody doesn't stick around, so that employer brand thing, it's not just about making yourself look the most attractive as possible. It's making sure that the employer brand actually matches up with who you are internally, right? So what your culture actually, what you're selling as your culture is what your culture actually is. And we've seen some founders be really open and vulnerable about where their gaps are and the things that they need to improve. And I think that is, it's one of those things. It's like you mentioned earlier about that when you have a team that feels safe, it might seem like they're doing worse because they're more transparent about their mistakes. And I would imagine there's a bit of a fear factor, potentially even specifically when you're talking to your investor, somebody who's funded you and you have to report on, like that might be a scary thing to do. And I think also like from the retention standpoint or the employer brand standpoint, there's always that short-term incentive of we have to get somebody in, so we're going to sell this as hard as we can. But that medium term impact of them then leaving quickly, and similar with investors, there's that trust equation where if you're not being transparent about issues and then working together maybe to figure out how to solve them, and then those things come up after when you haven't talked about it, I would imagine that erodes trust even more.
Oh, I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about, I mean, openness and vulnerability. I would say, if anything, is a signal of, a very positive signal, because, and we can talk about it in the context of, prospective candidates for an employer, or in the context, as you rightly, pointed out, of like investor to sort of investee. But everyone who's remotely familiar with the world of startups know that there's always a problem. There's always something that isn't quite going right. And so for us, if anything, it's a worrying sign when the update is like, yeah, everything's great, no problem at all. And I think, I think candidates should, and I hope are also, critical thinkers, and will also probably welcome some openness and vulnerability about the state of the company and the challenges that they face, and potentially make them want to be part of the solution and make them want to be part of the adventure even more. So 100% would definitely encourage always to err on the side of sort of transparency, openness, vulnerability. And I think it's a topic that we're going to talk about in a second. But Bolton's put and now invest a lot of time and effort into setting up a founder well-being program. And happy to go into a bit more detail about what that entails. But I think something that we've learned is for us as investors to almost make the first step around being open and vulnerable about us as human beings, as well as us
Mm.
maybe in our professions, to make sure that the relationship that we're building with founders in particular is very much built on this foundation of transparency and trust ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a whole webinar on that, from founder to leader, and it's about building trust. So do subscribe because you can get access to it. But yeah, it's one of the things that we talk about is that process of doing that both, and that's great that you're doing that because it's really important for founders and leaders then to model that as well. It's one of the things we tell leaders all the time. If they if they get to the point where they've already lost that trust, it's much harder. But then also, if they want to encourage other people to be open about their mistakes, they also have to be open about their mistakes. And I think for founders, it's a tough shift to make because so much of their time is selling externally an idea that isn't fully formed, maybe doesn't fully function. And so there's a certain level of not dishonesty, but optimism and confidence that might not be fully felt. And I think sometimes that then gets turned and faced internally and to their investor partners, and that then loses. So they're terrified of showing any vulnerability, and that then ultimately loses the trust.
Mm.
So, you mentioned a bit about Balderton's support, and I think it's really interesting that you spend the time investing in that. So, yeah, happy for you to talk a little bit more about that, and also like what you've seen from founders and what led you to focus on founder well-being and the support that you give to founders.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the inception here is back to the business case we were discussing earlier. We believe that founders that are in the right mindset, that are not excessively, sort of stressed, or that are giving the space to be their best selves for their teams, among other things, equal better results for us as a fund. And I think it started off from just anecdotal kind of stories of seeing um, founders making surprising, not to say bad decisions on the in very kind of high pressure situations. And so we decided a few years ago, and a bit of a narrative as well, that this sense that there's a lot of pressure was coming from the VC investor community, and then there was this expectation on founders to work, always work more, whereas actually we had some hypotheses around, for example, diminishing returns of working always kind of putting in very, very kind of long hours. And so we 2 years ago we set up a journey to actually survey hundreds of European founders to start to really validate some of these hypotheses. And so, finding that some of the biggest challenges that facing founders are around, so, managing their time and energy well, and realizing that actually there was probably a smarter way of working and looking after themselves mentally, physically, was integral to their long-term success. Changing the narrative around, like, it's not a sprint, building a company is more of a marathon than a sprint, or a marathon with multiple kind of made of multiple sprints, but you need to kind of take the time in between. I think there's definitely a theme around loneliness. Like, it can feel very kind of lonely at the top. So again, the program is here to build stronger kind of communities amongst our co-founders and CEOs. And then last year, so second year running, the survey went a little bit deeper, built on some of the insights from the first year, and it shed the light on some very basic material issues around, for example, liquidity that founders face. And so, if you're worried about not being able to meet your family's needs, at the end of the month, like you can't possibly be in the best kind of mindset to grow your business.
Yeah.
So we've got the Balderton Founder Wellbeing and Development Program, which is for use to, to all CEOs and founders from the portfolio are invited to partake in aspects of that program. And I'm strong, and I think, it's focused on founders, but also with the vision that we want to help our founders bring their best selves to their teams, and that the culture, coming back to the topic of culture, like the culture setting comes from the top, like, and it is going to start with the founder, and we can talk about lots of tactics and different operational models that work as the business grows, but it'll always come back to that person or those few individuals on the top. And so that's why we felt it was a particularly sort of worthwhile and important investment for ourselves as a fund, but also for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. We're always talking about modeling behavior from the leadership level because you could say all you want that these are the things that we want you to look after yourselves. We want you to prioritize your well-being. But if they're then watching you not doing that or not being vulnerable or not sharing any mistakes, people are going to interpret that as the real message, right? They'll watch what you do rather than what you say. So I think it's really important, and I feel like there's a sort of a consistent theme in like the short-term things that founders might feel like they should be doing, burning the candle at both ends, working really hard, getting the best people in regardless of what they have to say and sell about their culture, not being vulnerable. Like those short-term things that feel most comfortable are the things that are going to ultimately hurt you. So it's you kind of have to take that breath and say, I might feel like I can work all weekend for multiple weekends in a row, and I might feel that now, but I am going to pay that price for that in a month or in 2 months. And I think that's one of the big shifts that we're trying to ask founders to make. And so much of what they're dealing with is, well, but I need to get hit payroll by the end of the month, or so there is that pressure. And I think what we have a lot of founders telling us, in particular, when they're seeking investment, they just don't have the capacity for anything else, and that is the full-time job on top of the full-time job. So what would you advice would you give a founder who says, I can't prioritize this now. I have to wait until after I secure
Um,
my investment.
well, taking a step back and thinking about actually what an upfront investment in your culture, and we're not talking monetary investment here, we're talking mostly time and
Yeah.
thoughtfulness, really, and intentionality could actually pay off in the fundraise. I think, secondly, on the topic of transparency and vulnerability, I think bringing the whole team on the journey and just at the very, you can build so much of a culture can be built in times of hardship.
Mm.
And so just being, again, like extremely kind of vulnerable and say, well, my number one job right now is to focus on this fundraise, and these are all the sort of challenges that entails, and this is how the whole business is actually supporting this effort from whatever seat you're in. So that's that. And then lastly, I mean, I think delegation. So
Mm.
as the founder, you'll, always will be the ultimate owner of the company's culture, but it's not to say that you don't have allies. And even and that this holds in a 10 people, person company, like, need to have a head of people, a head of sustainability, someone to start really kind of proactively thinking about culture. Culture is it's so it's not very tangible, it's very fluid, but it can be it's the sum of it, it's some of lots of individual interactions and parts. And so just finding an ally who can and has the headspace to have that intentionality and thoughtfulness about culture whilst you're busy fundraising is definitely worth considering as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the things that founders need to again learn is that letting go of things, because we see in so many organizations that are growing, there's a decision bottleneck, but then there's also just a weight that sits on the founder's shoulders because they feel like all of this is their responsibility. And I think a lot of times they think of culture as an extension of themselves, whereas no, actually it's a series of things that everybody in the organization is doing. So that point of finding allies within the organization, people who can take on a little bit more of these pieces. There will always be other people who care about the culture, and really you want everybody to care about the culture.
Yeah,
So
and I think so, sorry, another example that came to mind on the flip side, like what is the risk of not getting right and thinking that the
yeah.
sequencing is definitely fundraised, then worry about culture. Anecdotally, you know, I was looking at a company, you know, exciting kind of potential target opportunity recently, and I Googled the company and say reviews, thinking I was looking for a product review. And all of a sudden, I had Glassdoor and Indeed and other, you know, kind of job kind of review sites, and actually toxic culture came up
Mm,
in the reviews. It was relatively low ratings, and so you know, I'd be lying to say like, oh, immediately that was a deal breaker, but obviously that for us was definitely a cause for kind of further
yeah.
investigation. And you know, you might ask me, yeah, how do we gauge for culture and those kind of in how we engage with companies who are fundraising, and we invest a lot of time in getting to know the co-founders and sometimes you know the extended sort of leadership team, because again, like we believe that a little bit the same way I describe the employee employer kind of dynamic. This is also we're entering into a marriage, a multi-year kind of marriage with another company, and so you know the longer I spend in the VC industry, the more I realize so much of it comes down to relationship and the trust that is built there. And so we believe that just spending time and getting to know people humanly gives us a good insight into a company's culture and how important and you know strategically this agenda has been sort of treated to date.
Yeah, so how importantly and strategically the agenda has been achieved to date, I think is a really important point for people to take away in terms of like when they're going for investment, that is something that will be considered. And and yeah, how are they going to deal with that? And as you said, if it's going wrong, then that doesn't mean that you can't fix it. Or but I would imagine somebody who came to you, if that company came to you and said, no, it's fine, they're just a bunch of whiners, versus a company that said to you, we know we have a problem and here's our plan to fix it. I would imagine the latter would be far more likely to get the investment than the former.
Yeah, they definitely.
Yeah. Are there any other red flags that, besides seeing a series of reviews on places like Glassdoor and Indeed flagging up a negative culture?
I mean, the other one that comes to mind is churn. Obviously, you
Mm,
know, that's always, but that's not necessarily, you know, we don't systematically ask to see kind of churn data in sort of early stage of a discussion with the company. But, you know, that's definitely a red flag, I think. For any company. So, you know, if you start to see a lot of people leaving, like you need to kind of
yeah.
start to understand why. And in few cases, it might be completely coincidental, but often it isn't.
Mm,
And then I think, you know, the red flags will be if the topic is dismissed, you know, quickly kind of
yeah.
dismissed by the co-founders. So we
Yeah.
definitely not after people who are getting it perfect. We just want people who care about it and who want to get it.
Yeah.
You know, give it their best shot and be extremely. I think humility, and I guess comes back to you know those we we're talking about openness and vulnerability earlier, but you know humility is something that we really appreciate in founders as well, and just being very open about what they don't know and recognizing there's something they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, I mean, such an important point. Nobody has it perfect, right? I mean, there's no organization that has everything perfect and has managed to overcome all of the systemic inequality and not replicated any of it in their environment. So it is just about prioritizing it and making sure that you have a plan and strategy around that. So that's really good to hear. I've got one more question for you, and then I'm gonna share some tips on things that folks can put into place. But then we're gonna go to audience questions. So if you haven't popped your question in, we've got a couple of good ones in there. But if you haven't popped your question in, now is the time. But the last question is, when should startups start thinking about this? Like, is there any particular stage that you think they need to start thinking about culture?
Ah, good question. Well, I mean, the sooner the better, and now I feel I'm probably at the stage of the session where I'm going to be repeating myself. But the culture starts with the founding team, and so and I think the question is more like, at what point do you shift from you building the culture by design rather than by
Mm,
default, and that's when I strongly encourage leaders to get to understand and educate themselves on what is culture, how does one build culture in a new nascent, potentially fast-growing organization, and then boiling down to like 5 tactics or strategies or commitments that they're going to put in place themselves, or as mentioned, sort of delegated to someone, a champion or an owner. Because I think the sooner that you shift that lens from default to
mm.
design by design, and the more intentional you are, the more you can very early on set the course for something that will become more and more kind of inherent and integral to the company, as opposed to getting yourself into a place where everything needs to be kind of retrofitted and culture is hard to change as well, and that's why
Mm.
just being really thoughtful upfront about um setting up the best culture, setting up your organization for success is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. The sooner you do it, the easier the issues are to fix and adjust and address. Which I think is a good segue into what do we do now. We do have some questions coming in, so if anybody else has any questions, please do post them. But before we go to that, I want to share some tips on what to do. I've got four easy steps um, to try to keep it simple. And I think the first thing that I think is really important is to define your culture with specific behaviors. So a lot of organizations will come up with values, and those are great and really great things to anchor what you believe in and what you prioritize. But sometimes what we've seen quite often is that there isn't a mutual understanding of what those values mean. So as one organization we were working with, they had a forgive the language, their language, not mine, no bullshit, as one of their values. But the staff interpreted it as complete in a completely different way than the leadership team did. So if you can still have the catchy thing, but underneath it, make it really specific. So something like, I acknowledge things that I don't know. There was one founder we were talking about, and she was going from 5 to 10, and her biggest concern was she was starting to see people not being as willing to say, I don't know the answer to that, or I'm not sure about that. And they were creating a new medical device. And so she was really concerned about that. So being really specific about, this is a behavior we're expecting of you, is really helpful to align people on. The second is that anonymous structured developmental feedback. And we have another whole webinar on feedback, which I recommend, but this is so important for both retention and also people's development. But what we also find in startups is they'll do things that feel like a stop, start, continue model, but that's actually putting a really big cognitive load on folks. Like, and it's expecting them to sort of be a trained organizational psychologist so they can figure out what is it exactly that you should be doing or not doing. When you put it into something that's more structured, then you can actually get more actionable, useful feedback and feedback that you can develop. The next piece is about measurement, and for the engineers in the group, you'll know how important measurement actually is. And this allows you to uncover those things that are maybe underneath the surface, and that need to be covered and need to be addressed, and you can do that before they cause risk. So just to give you an example, we had an organization that we worked with that were able to improve 81% of the behaviors that they measured simply by making people aware of how often they were doing something or not doing something. But even more importantly, they were able to identify the things that they continued to be able need to work on. And for those, they did a more in-depth workshop and talked to each other about what was going on and fixed it and sorted it out. And the last piece is hiring well. And we talked a little bit about this. And it might not mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean do 15 rounds of interviews with 3 different tests and make it really arduous. It actually means just creating a really structured process that stops your brain from taking shortcuts. And when we talk about like inclusive recruitment practices, again, people will think about it as, well, what about merit? This is absolutely about merit because it's stopping our brain from taking the shortcut answer and putting us through a rigorous process to make sure that we actually get to the accurate solution. So we have built a platform to help you with this if you don't want to do it on your own. So that's what Culture Plus actually is. And we'd love for you to join us on the platform. So if you'd like a demo, please do sign up. We'll post a link in the chat, but or just message us. We'd like to talk to you more about it. But now we're going to go to your questions because we've had a few come in. And let's see. So I think the first one I wanna direct to you, Elodie, which is how do you demonstrate to investors that you have a good culture? Is it based on your own assurances?
Um, I mean, a few things come to mind is retention rate. So we've talked about, churn. So on the flip side, like, retention rate, great. We're as well as a number of other VCs starting to ask portfolio companies whether they run employee engagement surveys. So again, like that, is used as a sort of a proxy for at least, I mean, you might say it's one thing collecting perspectives, another thing actually acting on it, but it's a good start. It's a good place to start. And then another one is, I know some companies do net promoter scores, like as part of those employee survey. So these, I guess, are the few hard data points that I can think of that would definitely come to back up claims of sort of great culture. But then I'd also say that conversely, if the culture is not good, it's not that will eventually come out. There'll be particular incidents or trends that are going to be symptomatic of bad culture, and so that's probably what we would be on the lookout for. But great if we're on the flip, preemptively kind of showing how great the culture is.
Yeah, fantastic. And also you can put Culture Plus into play. That would also show that you're working towards it. But anyway, but yeah, so I think there's some very tangible things, but then also it shows itself in other areas, doesn't it? Another we had a question that I might ask. We have Marin Bird, who's our research and impact lead here as well. And it's around that 35,000 pounds for entry level employees. And I think we can share the detail, we can share the citation of that post the webinar. But did you want to give a quick answer to that, Marin?
Absolutely. So yeah, that figure is it's linked to two kind of separate costs, I suppose. And the first and the primary cost is around getting folks up to speed. So essentially, it's the loss of output whilst you get somebody into a position where they are an expert and understand exactly what's going on. So I think it goes without saying that's going to be very high for many of you. That time period is going to change, depending on what the level of expertise in the role is. But the average time is 28 weeks to get a new employee up to optimal productive level, I think is what they call it. And in terms of that retention piece, this particular report didn't actually look at that. They just looked at cost of replacing somebody. So I think ideally you're retaining people for as long as possible so that you aren't incurring that cost more and more frequently. But yeah, there's lots of interesting things in the actual research around what that means in terms of different industries. So they looked at retail, I think they looked at marketing, and they looked at industry, so much more aligned with engineering context as well. So I'll pop the link in the chat if folks want to dig into that. It's quite lengthy, but I'll do that now.
Great. Thank you, Marin. And Elodie, we had a question come in direct to us, which is specifically to you about whether or not you're seeing any shift in priorities as we're seeing this sort of global backlash. Well, not global backlash, but in certain countries, we're seeing a bit of a backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion as a concept. Are you seeing that being impacted in either Balderton's approach or in the startup scale up community at all?
I think, I mean, it's definitely raising more questions, but I think those questions are fair and healthy challenge because it's forcing us to really reiterate and clarify the why we're doing all these things in the first place. And so I think that in some pockets of the world and on some industries, maybe it had been taken too far in terms of what this sort of so-called DI agenda kind of represented, and it had become extremely kind of performative, whereas and whereas actually I think that the first principle kind of thinking around integrating and leveraging a sort of diversity of experience and thought, that argument remains. And in fact we're seeing now case studies of companies who completely reactively said they dropped everything on this agenda and are actually now losing tenders to competitors who maintain this. I think it wouldn't be fair to just dismiss this overall big kind of conversation as complete nonsense. I think let's embrace and welcome it as a sort of healthy reset and refocusing on what this agenda and its importance for the business community and commercial success was for in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really good points. And I feel like it's important to be more explicit than ever about like this is what's acceptable and this is what isn't acceptable in our organizations. So things like just being fair and equitable and treating everybody equally. What does it actually mean for us? And this is what we accept and this is what we don't. I think that's going to be ever more important in our workplaces. Um, but yeah, definitely not going away. And as you said, Elodie, the folks who are just reacting quickly are not doing so well, and we'll probably continue to see some pretty bad long term results. So I am conscious, Elodie, I know you have to drop off precisely at 4. I think there are a couple of more questions here that we could probably cover with the Honeycomb Works team, but I wanted to say thank you so much for your time. Know how busy you are, and really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, thank you for all of your wonderful insights.
You're very welcome. Lovely to meet you all. Take care. Bye bye.
Great. So I'm just going to say a thank you to everyone who attended as well. And yes, I'm going to ask you to subscribe. We do have a couple of questions here that I can spend a couple of minutes on after I say thank you. But we'll always follow up in our newsletters, and we'd love to see you at future events. So do join, do subscribe. We'd love to continue the conversation. And there are 2 questions here, Elodie. We might come back to you and maybe ask you to do a short summary on that we'll put in the newsletter. But there is one more on specifically about question 2 that I might go into more detail now. But thank you all, and you will get recordings if anybody needs to drop off on at 4 o'clock precisely. But let me drop into number 2. So yeah, so the question was about explaining more about getting anonymous structured developmental feedback. And I suppose there are quite a few different words in that. And I think the anonymous piece is important because you want to have a way for people to be able to share their thoughts without comfortably and without it feeling like every individual is identified. So that anonymity piece, so that people feel safe to share feedback, is important. But it is really important that it's structured, because without it being structured, getting anonymous feedback from people that is not helpful can be really detrimental. And when I say structured, I go back to this idea on the first part, which is a bit of a prerequisite for it, which is, what are you specifically asking? What behaviors do you want to know about? So it might be saying, look, this is something that I'm working on. I'd like you to tell me how I'm doing on this. And various startups have different ways. People who are doing this well have different ways of doing it. Some have set up Google Forms to do it. You can do this via Culture Plus. That's one of the reasons why we built it, so that you could have this structured way of getting really good, useful feedback. But even if you don't use the Culture Plus platform, it's really important to set up some kind of structure there, and making it a regular, ongoing thing. Because if people don't know what is being asked of them, they won't be able to give good valuable feedback. We also have our belonging survey, which, again, you don't have to use ours. There are other ones. If you want the questions, we're happy to share the questions with you. So there are, but if you do that measurement on a regular basis, and again, this should be anonymous, then you can actually measure that over time, whether or not people are feeling safe, whether or not they're feel like they belong. And then if you can marry that to behavioral data, you can see why and how people are doing. The last piece is developmental. So you absolutely have to make sure that there's a space for feedback and support that does not feed into pay or promotion. Because once it feeds into pay and promotion, people will be very cautious about what they're sharing. And you simply won't get good data from yourself or at the organizational aggregate level, because people will just mostly be positive. Some organizations where it's highly competitive, they might be a little bit negative, more negative, but it won't be accurate, is the point. But if it's strictly for development, first of all, I, as an individual who's asking for that feedback, asking for that data on myself, I'm much more likely to ask people that might be critical, and I'm much more likely to be open to what I'm being told, because I know that it's strictly for my development. Nobody else will see it but me, so I can be vulnerable. And then the people who are offering that feedback and do that knowing that my manager's not going to see it, it's not going to harm me in the organization, it's not going to ruin my reputation. It's strictly for me to be able to improve myself. So hopefully that answers that question. Of course, happy to have a longer conversation. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn, or schedule a demo, and we can talk more about different ways that we can do that. But if not, do subscribe, and we'll send you regular tips and things on a regular basis. But thank you, everyone, for attending. Really enjoyed it, and thank you for your participation. Those who participated in the chat, makes it always a little bit more lively for us. And we'll see you at Building World Class Teams 8, or maybe at one of our live events coming up in June and July. Bye.